go to one of the, and he right where you go. You go to the stack, pull it up, says, well, you should have seen blah, blah, blah. Then
Oh,
people
my.
say, oh, shit, sorry I asked.
Oh,
If you end up having to say sorry I asked, that generally, I think that generally reflects the professor.
Yeah, oh, yeah, he was an ass.
There's a way to teach it when they're being a dick to your students, and I don't think the second one should be part of it, but, everybody has their own,
We did a ton of stuff. Actually, the best class we had was organizational theory by a guy named Dick Dabb, and he had wrote the book. He was like, at that time, back in the 80s, it was the textbook for organizational theory, and he read the book.
Huh.
That's some of the best.
I was gonna say, when you're dealing with an expert, that's the best.
I'll tell you about one. I'll tell you about Carter Racing. So remind me of that. I'll tell you that story. Carter Racing was probably one of the top case studies we did. Carter Racing. And then we did another case study where a guy, he was running a division and the CEO came in and he wasn't prepared. So he had someone underneath him who just absolutely sabotaged and cost him his job.
oh my.
Oh, and that was, so the moral of that story was,
Don't trust anyone, know what you're doing.
Boss comes to town, don't let someone.
Don't look bad from the boss,
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah.
There's nothing worse than that.
Well, it was just the politics of it, it was just unbelievable.
That's one of the things I try to stress the most to my students, like when I talk, that personally, that, what you're gonna be doing is, there's no substitute for getting used to the fact that the business world is entirely about politics. Like the business of business politics is very difficult.
Academics, you have your share too. I was a professor for 2 semesters at Wesco, night school. I taught accounting 2 semesters. And there was plenty of politics there.
Well, and I'll say this too, this isn't just the business world, academia is full of it. And the quote, the famous quote is,
Publish or perish.
oh no, you're right, publish or perish, but even more to the point about the internecine politics of academics is the fighting is so fierce because the rewards are so small. I mean, you will not find a group more willing to argue with itself than an academic department. I mean,
I only made it 2 semesters as a night teacher, and all the day professors got pissed off because I would take out my students in the night class, and up until the 2 semesters I taught, the day students we had the same test, for all classes, and the day students always beat the night students. And so I like to win. I'm very competitive. I said, we are going to win.
You and me both.
Have the highest scores. So I would take the class out to go to B-dubs.
Ooh.
And I said, you guys are going to earn your wings. So I would take them every Monday night to go to B-dubs, and we would work through. And when they had higher scores, I got crucified. They just destroyed them. The students.
Yeah, the department, right? Yeah. Oh yeah.
I got good reviews, but the other accounting professors just destroyed.
Like I'm saying, man, academia is its own worst enemy sometimes. It really sometimes astounds me how little the actual struggles of campus get railroaded for the interpersonal struggles of departments.
I might try it again at some point.
You should. You should.
That was several years before I started the command. Back when I was at Western WKD, I taught there.
Speaking of that, the 2 people that are involved in the project we're talking about got into a very heated thing with me on an email chain about IRB approval. I won't call them.
I told you. I mean,
Hey, IRG is the most
The one in
obnoxious thing to do.
The one in the other department was like, yeah, you have to get it, not getting it is lazy, and then the one in this department came back and was like, it's not lazy, it's not historical convention. I'm just
It's
sitting there.
not, and this, frankly, you're writing a thesis in this department. This is who you should listen to Terry.
because that's one of those things that drives me up the damn wall.
More politics.
Yeah, not just politics, but the politics of an academic university are often very, very territorial. You guys may not see it a ton, but your professors spend half their time arguing with each other over the dumbest shit. Myself included.
Oh, goodness.
All right.
This is good, Reed.
Do you just interject with oh, here's a good restaurant and see how things go?
I'll say that I generally keep my stuff to myself as what you would call at the very best a junior faculty member, especially as a PTL. It's never a good idea to poke the tenured professors, but I will say academic institutions, not just U of L, all of them, are very siloed. Everybody has the thing they do and the thing they're good at. And it's what happens when you kind of deal with each other that sometimes, and once you factor in seniority and rank and what you know and who you know, it gets very interesting. I'll say that.
One question right before we get started. Did you see the year update thing that I did?
You're what?
The update on the years, like.
Yes, I got it. It was good.
Because, I was talking to both of them, they were like, 40 years is just too much.
Well, it wasn't even that I thought your lit review was not long enough. I was more thinking about it in the terms of, is there more current scholarship you could make sure that you knew that fit the period, not the other way around. It wasn't that I thought all your sources were old. It was more just thinking if there was anything modern in your scholarship you needed to cover.
Oh, yeah. But by narrowing it down, you think it's complete?
I think it's good. Yeah. I think it's really good. Yeah, we'll talk more. All right, so how are we doing?
Pretty bad.
I like fantastic. That's always good. I never get that response from my American 2 freshmen. Ugh.
This was really interesting reading.
Oh, so you guys have read, where are you guys up to in the reading, Lynn?
Linear warfare.
Linear warfare, okay. You're already at linear warfare?
We were supposed to be this week.
Oh, okay, yeah, you're reading it this week.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you guys should have read through the Crucible of War as far as you should be. Yes, cool, okay, so, yes, you guys, you're the only one who's responded to the discussion board, aren't you?
Yeah.
Get to it, the rest of you. It's due Sunday.
It's not my fault.
Okay, also,
I posted it like a week and a half ago.
Your dates,
We're gonna wait.
your dates are really confusing.
It says it's due Saturday night.
No, it says Saturday 9/12. Saturday is,
I thought I fixed it.
no, it's still bad, like this morning.
Well, you know what? It doesn't matter because you need to be doing your discussion boards throughout the week, not just waiting until Sunday night to do it. So
Okay,
don't
so
even
question.
give me that
So
nonsense.
question, would Sunday at 11:59 PM be the cutoff?
So yes, Sunday at 11:59 is always going to be the cutoff for
Okay.
discussions in this class. Even if I mislabel it, it's always Sunday at 11:59.
Okay.
However, if you post 3 times on Sunday from like noon to 11:59, I'm not going to be happy with you. You might get your points the first time you pull that, but I'm not going to be happy with you. That's not a discussion. That's just trying to write your stuff down enough to hit the bare minimum. And given that the bare minimum in this class is quite low, I expect something higher than that from you guys. Got it? All right. Just so we're clear. John had a great question about the project. I will hopefully have the explainer for the project for you guys relatively soon. Today is actually going to be the first time. Hello, Michael. Today is going to be the first time we're going to do a case study of a battle, and that is going to be very like what you'll be doing for the project. So you'll get a very good feel of how I do it, and that way you'll know how you'll do it. So you don't have to worry too much about that. It is coming up in the next few weeks, or next month or so. How's the proposal going for you guys? That's due in 10 days. It's never a good sign.
You know this, there's 3 people that know this, there was another proposal that had to get turned in first.
Yes, you have a lot on your plate. I'll give you that. The rest of you I know have a lot on your plate, but you know what? Frankly, that's college. So get to work. All I can say is, do that. If you're having an issue of coming up with a topic, or you're still thinking about stuff and you want to run something by me, shoot me a note. We can schedule a time. Kyle can tell you, we chatted for almost an hour and a half about his senior honor thesis. I am always happy to chat about papers, about what's going on in your life, whatever you want to talk about. I'm there for it, okay?
And he's not hideous behind the mask. I was really scared.
Good looking out, Kyle. I will say that. There's one handsome man in the place. All right. Very humble man, speaking of work. Very humble. The best at being humble. Maybe the most humble professor you've ever had. So, where did we leave off? Other than my rambling nonsense that takes up half of class.
We're talking about artillery.
Okay, so we were still working on this. Yeah, we had finished talking about the interplay between the 3 parts of what I'm going to be describing, essentially infantry, cavalry, artillery. So if there was a takeaway here, what would the big takeaway be about the age of reason and military warfare at the time?
Doesn't seem like an age of reason, seems like barbarism.
Why would you think it sounds like barbarism? It's a good point.
Just the savagery of the bayonets and the new artillery and the intervention of gunpowder weapons doesn't seem like a reasonable.
So you're hitting on a really important point that I want everybody to understand very clearly. When this era is called the age of reason, especially as it relates to the military, this time is seen as an era of limited warfare, like we've talked about. What does limited mean, though? When I say limited, what am I talking about?
It's
looking at the, like we were talking about the kind of warfare that was going on in the 30 Years' War, where it's total war, nothing's off limits, just burn villages down, so you can feed your troops. It's limited in that capacity. It's not limited in the capacity of, let's find new and interesting ways to kill the other army, but it's, okay, yeah, we can use these fun toys to kill the other army, but not.
Not the civilian. Okay, I really like that explanation.
Honestly, just forgot what I was saying. But,
I like that explanation less, but you know what happens. I'll come back to you, Greg. John.
I was gonna say the civilian aspect of it was one of the big.
Okay.
I was gonna say, like, rules of engagement are coming out, like, you can't shoot officers, like, you can only take prisoners if you can, and like, stuff like that. Just like, stuff to just limit the death and destruction of just the past.
Very good.
Let's kill the prisoners, that's nice.
So yeah, we're no longer just mass slaughtering peasants after every interaction. That's a great start. But you know, as you said, and you know, I think your definitions are very good. Generally, when we say limited warfare, the warfare itself between combatants has not gotten limited in any way. It's still a bloody, nasty business that is warfare. The technology has certainly made it just as bloody as a longbow and a sword were, you know, 50, 100 years before that. The gunpowder hasn't changed a ton. The battle and the bloodiness of battle itself doesn't change. It's something almost immutable. Going back to the very first recorded battle at Megiddo, you know, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, to the very last time an insurgent shot at an American soldier in Iraq a few minutes ago. War is bloody. There's no getting around that. When we talk about the age of reason or the age of limited warfare, what we're talking about is the European interpretation of that warfare as it relates to keeping the contests limited in terms of their impact on the civilian population, as well as their overall cost. These wars that take many years, that end up being very, very undisciplined, very, very unorganized, European monarchs want those to end. They want to have their wars and their battles, but they want them to feel and look like a parade ground. They don't want them to look like war. There's a reason that during this period, officers' uniforms look like this. They're flashy, they're showy, and as you'll be reading in the Lynn chapter, there's a lot more about the officers who lead these units as gentlemen, and the rank and file who fill up these units as kind of the dregs of society. And so generally what you see is the men who lead these regiments, these officers, these gentlemen, are there because they're the upper crust of society. And they need to be there to control the men in line, who are the dregs of society, as we'll talk about. The very, very worst people generally in a society at this point are drafted into these European militaries. It's a very different way of thinking of things. But when I say limited, don't think that people who are participating in these battles aren't dying hideously. What I'm talking about is generally their effect on the civilian population. So, very good. Do we feel pretty good about the age of reason? What I really want to get our hands on is that a big context of the age of reason and the fighting in this manner can only really work in a system and in a society where there's actually the geographical ability to fight this way. These big, long lines, these big, big battlefield formations require a lot of space, cultivated land to make these things work. We're going to try and translate this form of warfare to where? The wilderness that is the new world at the time. And so in trying to translate this, what we get, well, hey, we're going to talk about it today. I'll let you be the judge of it. As we walk into one of those weird interactions between old world militarism and new world geography. Probably one of the most famous expeditions in American history. So if you're at home, switch over to Braddock's March.
Disaster.
Disaster is a better way to put it. Braddock's disaster, Braddock's ambush, Braddock's defeat are all better ways to think about it. But first, let's start with the march. Here he is. This is Edward Braddock. Edward Braddock is British. And like I said, when we left off, the French and English were contemplating war. This is after George Washington's disastrous attempt to gain control of the forks of the Ohio, the failure of Fort Necessity, and the terrible signing of the letter after the death of Jumonville. You remember all of this, right? And now the French and the English government, the French and the British governments have to make a decision. Do they want to make the Ohio country worth it? Do they want to launch another war with each other over such a far away, and up to this point, such a insignificant part of their empires? After all, the whole point of this was because George Washington and the Virginia Company wanted to, or the Ohio Company wanted to explore this land for the first time. And now the two most dominant and powerful empires in Europe are considering going to war over it.
So wasn't one of the main concerns of the British containment from the French? So hasn't like they are being contained by the French right now?
Quite literally on the seaboard. In fact, as we've kind of talked about with that moving frontier, so to speak, there are some English and other British intellectuals, so to speak, saying that if for some reason they're stopped at the Appalachians, not only will the colonies fail, but they may be driven out of the New World entirely. Is that based in any fact? No, of course not. We've talked a little bit about the demographic differences between the French population and the English population. If anything, eventually England was going to grow too big anyways. The 13 colonies were growing at such a rapid rate, they would have swamped the French no matter what in terms of population pushing across. But that's not how the British took it. In fact, the French expedition that kicked Washington out of the Ohio country freaks the British government out. And they send out Edward Braddock, a British general, with regulars. Several regiments of regulars. I hope you guys know that I'm going to start referencing different sizes of military units. If you do not know the reference sizes of military units off the top of your head, I strongly recommend Googling and getting used to it. I need to say things like company, regiment, battalion, brigade, division. I need to be able to say these words, and you guys need to know how many men I'm talking about. A regiment, in this case, as we're talking about, is between 800 and 1,000 men at the time. Actually, excuse me, that's wrong. Between 400 and 600. So even I can struggle with these numbers still. Smaller. What we would consider these were regular redcoats, those guys that you all know and all love from the American Revolution. We're talking about the line regiments of regular troops sent from Europe. These are not militia. These are not men who have ever been in the New World before. They are the men who populate the armies in the Age of Reason. These are your general guys, so to speak. Braddock, then, given what I just said, comes from what part of society? Upper class or lower class? Upper class. Braddock is well connected at Parliament. He is a long service member of the British military, and he has been given command of an expedition to drive the French from the Ohio country. At the time, obviously any preparations made in Britain are going to filter via news to who? The French. The French are well aware this expedition is coming. Both sides are well aware of the importance of this expedition. Braddock's expedition lands in Williamsburg, and it takes a long time for an expedition like this to actually get moving. At the time, these armies, especially in the New World, had a very hard time supplying themselves day to day. This is well before what we would consider living off the land as part of a military campaign. That really won't come around until the Napoleonic Wars. So what I'm saying here is, for an army of even a few thousand men, Braddock's expedition is just north of 2,000 men. Even for an expedition that small, it required lots and lots of transport, lots and lots of wagons, lots and lots of draft animals. These expeditions aren't just guys walking with a backpack. It's miles and miles of wagon trains behind them. Does anybody know what Colonial is? The one who organizes most of Braddock's expeditions trains. He's commended by the British government for his participation. I'll give you a hint, he's a printmaker. Right. Benjamin Franklin plays a very big role in getting Braddock's expedition off the ground. There are a lot of important Americans, or who later will become important Americans, who participate in this expedition. In fact, the British officer group and the colonials who gather around it are a who's who of important people we'll know later. Anybody know who else is in this expedition? Well, one, who is the guy that Braddock, first and foremost, seeks out when he reaches America? George Washington. He appoints Washington as a what? appoints him as a colonial officer and a scout for the expedition. Why would he pick Washington?
Because he's the dude who started.
He's just been there. It's not even like oh, you idiot, you messed this all up thing. You're the only one who's been there. Washington is gladly received at the British camp and brought in. Anybody know who Thomas Gage is?
Freaking name.
You guys should all recognize him from Lexington and Concord fame. He's the British officer who's in command at Boston during the American Revolution. He's here. How about Daniel Morgan?
Like the alcohol.
Not the alcohol. You probably recognize him from the American frontier. There are a lot of Americans and a lot of British people who participate in this action that will become important later. I'll drop in a few others as we get to it. But the one thing to remember about this expedition is, despite how small it was in terms of its overall numbers, 2,000 men doesn't sound like a lot when the Battle of Fontenoy in 1747, that you'll read as part of Lynn's thing, has something like 150,000 men in it total. It's a small expedition. It's big in terms of its impact on the colonies, because this expedition, and many like it, will begin a pattern of British and I'm going to quote this, American interaction. Part of the reason the French and Indian War is so important for the development of the United States, or will eventually become the United States, is there is a graphic difference between the British officers who arrive in the colonies and the American colonists they find. Despite what the American colonists will eventually fight a big chunk of this war, and who will participate in this war in a big way in terms of taxes and a big way in terms of blood and iron, quite literally, the British, what is their general opinion of the Americans they come to meet? Ugh. What? Peasants.
Yeah.
The general feeling is the Americans, and to quote a few of them, vagabonds, ruffians, provincials. The militia cannot be trusted. They looked at these Americans, and did they see fellow British gentlemen?
No, they saw outside.
They generally saw outsiders. And so, when I say American, what are we talking about here? What are we talking at the very beginning underpinning of?
Colonials.
What we would essentially call the birth of an American identity. Now, this identity obviously is going to predate this war. It goes back to the separateness of 30,000 miles of geographical distance from the home country. But we have to get from this war to the American Revolution relatively quickly. How long after this war does the Revolution happen?
20 years.
12.
Depends on when you want 1765.
Let's go from
12 years, yeah.
1763 to 1775.
12
12 years.
The French and Indian War was 64 to 70, or wait, 54 to 63.
54 to 63. So 63 is the end of this war to the beginning of the revolution. 12 years. That's a very short time, right? To go from fighting a war for empire to fighting a war to do what? To leave it. That's a big change. So we have to understand a lot of it, more than I can probably emphasize to you, comes from the interaction of British military units with their American counterparts. In fact, many of the American officers will reflect on the fact they feel very much looked down upon by the British. Not just in terms of their actual interactions, but here's another quirk of it. In terms of military rank, any British ranker, that is, any British guy off the boat, no matter how low his officer commission is automatically higher than what?
The colonists.
The American militia's own ranks. So would it be embarrassing if you're a guy like George Washington, who's a colonel in the Virginia militia, to be ordered about by a British lieutenant? It would be not only frustrating, it'd be deeply insulting, right? Especially for guys like this, and remember Washington's one of them, especially for guys who are raised to believe they're British nobility. Despite that vast difference in geography, did they feel it in terms of their identity? No. This war will do a lot to push the two groups away from each other. So let's get into the war. Braddock has a plan, and it's a bad plan, but it is his plan. His plan is instead of trying to find a shortcut to back to the original battlefield, which is at Fort Duquesne, the French fort that originally is constructed after the failure of the Fort Necessity expedition, Braddock decides that he is going to cut an overland route through the wilderness. As you might expect, given the difficulties of terrain, this is a very physically demanding decision. Braddock, slowly but surely, has to cut a road for his men, his artillery, and his transports over hundreds of miles of wilderness. This decision, for a guy like him, makes a lot of sense. It's easier to control. It's easier for him to have a nice, slow, plodding march. It links him to his supply lines. It fits what a very cautious, very aristocratic British officer would decide to do. However, what does it necessarily mean in terms of the speed of the campaign? It is absolutely slow. It is glacially slow. And that gives the French what? Time to prepare. The French will do just that. And this will be our first case study of a battle. Here's a nice beautiful view of Fort Duquesne. This is Fort Duquesne in the background. What you see here are quite a few natives and French. The two of them, particularly a small French garrison and a much larger group of native allies, are preparing to defend the fort. I'm going to spell this wrong, so I'm going to look back. P-U-Q. See, I was already wrong. Geez, my spelling is terrible. Fort Duquesne.
Who were the natives?
The natives are a mix of the usual groups that assist the French. There's Ottawa, there's Shawnee, there's Iroquois, there's quite a few different groups represented here. The easiest way to remember it is the usual French native tribes. So, these tribes, along with the French, are long practiced in this native style of warfare. We're talking about what? Not morning, so you're right about morning wars, but in terms of their actual battlefield appearance, what is the native way of warfare? Hit and run. So we have essentially a really great case study of two vastly different styles of warfare coming into contact with one another. We have the slow, plodding, marching columns coming into contact with an ambush, essentially. Let me see if I can find this on YouTube. It's sometimes easier to watch this than it is to explain it. How many of you all have seen The Last of the Mohicans?
I love
Oh,
it.
me.
It's a great movie, right?
Yeah, when they take the fort and get the town.
Actually, let's watch the ambush.
Oh, the amateur guy.
You like that?
It's one of my favorite movies.
It's an absolutely fantastic. Let's just watch a bit of this.
I will find you.
This is that British marching column I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah.
Very open,
Into the woods.
open and vulnerable.
And there's the
Can
trade.
you guys see something?
No, really.
Is there a way to make that better? Yeah. And watch the British reaction. It seems silly, but this is exactly how they react in real time.
It's a fun
Watch the natives find position, hide, it's an ambush. Even in that short clip, you can see what we're talking about here. The marching columns of the British are simply not prepared to deal with a native ambush. So let's look at it happen in real time in an actual battle. This is our first case study. From now on, when you see case study, that means we're going to talk out an actual battle, a specific battle for its import towards the general class. When you guys do a presentation for me that is your project for the midterm project, you'll be doing a case study of your own, in which you'll talk about the things I'll be talking about. I have a rubric, don't worry too much, but you guys will be picking a battle of your own to do within American history, within the context of this class. I will be vetoing some battles because I'll be doing case studies of my own. So when you guys send me your thoughts on that, I'll ask for not a proposal, but for just an email. It'll have to be one that I don't already have planned, a case study coming up. So don't be too disappointed if your first one gets vetoed. Obvious ones you shouldn't plan on doing. No Gettysburg. What other battles do you guys know off the top of your head? I don't know if I'll have to check Antietam. That Bunker Hill is definitely a case study.
New Orleans.
New Orleans is a case study.
Antietam?
Antietam might be, Bull Run isn't, I don't think. So you guys have some battles in mind. If you shoot me a note, only one person per battle. So I'll send out a reminder. So let's talk about it. This is right here is a tactical map. Remember, when you guys are discussing the 3 parts of a battle that you'll see more about, you're going to talk about the strategic implications of the battle, the operational implications of the battle, and the tactical implications of the battle. So let's try and do this together for the first one. And then from now on, I'll assume you guys know what I'm talking about when I say strategic, operational, tactical. Remember back to the very beginning of class when we discussed those 3 things. Let's start with the easiest. What is the strategic goal of Braddock's campaign?
Secure, I don't know, possibly push the French out or at least secure.
That's it. You nailed it. This is the big one. Your overarching campaign goal. Why you're sending that campaign out. That's your strategic goal. John is right. The goal of Braddock's expedition is to push the French out of the Ohio country, to secure it for the British Empire. Ergo, what is the French strategic goal of this campaign? To prevent the British from doing just that. The French have already secured the Ohio country by defeating Washington, theoretically, right? Now, they have another challenge to it. So there's your strategic overview. Obviously, you guys are going to go into more depth with the battle you pick. Operational. What are operations then? Here's your strategy. What comes next?
Like how you go in or something like that?
How you make this strategy work. The actual decision, the actual plan, or in this case, if we go back to click the wrong computer. If we go back to this map, this is your operations. This is the plan to make that strategy work. His decision, his operational decision, was an overland campaign that would secure a road back to the main colony so that if he wins, what could he easily do?
Just go down the road.
He'll have cut a new road to a new possession. That's his operational decision. Okay, does that make sense? And so what happens when we get to the battlefield, what happens when the battle is actually joined, is then what? Tactics. What happens during the battle? How command and control is exercised once battle it happens. The irony of this one is that there's almost no tactics in this battle. Neither side is in particularly good command of its army. So let's talk about it. This is one of the most famous battles, certainly the most famous battle in pre-American history of the American colonies. It's called the Battle of the Monongahela because of the big river nearby. You can see it here in the battle map. Here you have the British advance that is strung out in a long column are these little British ticks. This is usually how you see a battle. You usually see blocks of red and blue, depending on what the main color is of the units. Here it's red and blue for the French. This column represents Braddock's what?
Basically, it's convoy.
His convoy. Quite literally, along the road, they're cutting as they go. Braddock, by the time that they get to Fort Duquesne, by the time they're close to Fort Duquesne, within a day or two's march of it, what you see here is his attempt to speed things up, so to speak. As you can see, he's being watched, right? Here's the pictures of what's happening here. He has been watched from the very get-go, several miles from the fort by who? The French natives. The French and the natives, specifically native scouts who are a bit better at this than the French are. They have been watching his progress for quite a while. They've also noticed that unlike the French at the fort, he has an overwhelming supply of artillery. And if he reaches the fort, what's that going to mean for the French? They'll get blasted out of it. The whole point, this whole long damn trek to Fort Duquesne was predicated on the idea that they would capture the French fort, probably using the artillery they had painstakingly cut a road for, and then they'd punch the French out of that area. The French then have one choice. They have two choices, frankly. What are their choices here? What are their tactical choices? They can run. They could run, they could leave, they could abandon the fort. Sometimes discretion is the better part of valor. They could leave the fort, abandon it. The British outnumber them, probably in the neighborhood of 2 to 1. What else could they do?
Stop them from get into the fort.
Stop them before they get to the fort, which is exactly what they choose. They choose to ambush the British on the road to the fort. And so here is the Battle of the Monongahela. The the French regulars under Bijou, the commander of the French, you don't need to remember his name because of what happens in about 10 seconds. Bijou and the French regulars take up a post along the road.
How do you spell this thing?
Bijou, I think. Don't worry too much about him. He's about to catch a bullet.
Oh, no.
Bijou and the regulars form up along the road. And the natives do what? What they do best. They form firing lines along the trees, especially along the hill crest that looks down on the main road itself. And relatively quickly into the battle, what we have is a joining almost by accident of the two lines. They're not quite sure how quickly or who exactly initiated it, but very quickly the British run into French regulars holding the road and the natives who start firing at them from the trees. Almost immediately, though, Bijou is killed. Thomas Gage, the guy I just mentioned and who will be at Bunker Hill, watch Bunker Hill, is actually in the van. And pretty quickly the British break down. They're being fired at from the trees. They cannot generally see who is shooting at them. And dozens, then hundreds of redcoats are killed or wounded. Why?
They're out in the open.
They're out in the open. Quite look at the pictures. It's very clear. These big blocks of redcoats are being fired at by native snipers. Do they even have a chance to respond?
It's easy picking.
It's easy pickings. Very few French or native allies are killed during this battle. Hundreds of British regulars are killed, including who? Braddock is killed during the fighting. Now, a big part of the Age of Reason, and a big part of the reason that I need you guys to understand linear tactics is these men are supposed to be, the men in these ranks are supposed to be automatons, right? They don't make tactical decisions. Who does? The officers do. And what happens when the officers are killed?
We don't have anyone to tell us what to do.
Things go sideways pretty quickly. There's a reason that, I'm sure you guys have seen that stupid movie, The Patriot. There's a moment where Cornwallis complains about the Americans shooting British officers at the start of battles. It's because the Americans tended to. And because of that, it meant British armies often were what during the battle? Leaderless.
You kill an animal, you destroy the brain.
Frankly, at the time, you're 100% right. The body of an army at the time did not make very many decisions unless an officer told it to. And because of that, if officers got killed, things tended to break down quickly. In the end, ironically, who saves the day being a very, very loose interpretation of it? Because let's be clear, the column is largely defeated. They begin to flee back down that long, painstaking road. Braddock is killed, and he's buried somewhere along the line of march. We're still not sure. Washington takes over the retreat. Very good. Washington steps up in a moment that nobody really expected and leads a relatively skilled retreat. The body of Braddock, we still don't know really where it's buried because they dug a hole in the new road and then marched over it so the French couldn't take his body out. In the end, Braddock's expedition is a complete defeat for the British. Fort Duquesne is saved, and more importantly, what have the French and their allies demonstrated?
Is that European warfare is not going to work here?
It's not going to work here. European warfare is not conducive to New World geographical limitations. More to the point, did the British, does it look like in this battle, did it ever look like they had any real good idea what to do once the battle was joined?
They just look like they're just...
For most of the battle, they milled about in open ground, firing into the trees at puffs of smoke. As you might expect, that was not a particularly good way to deal with the natives who were firing into them.
So would like someone like Braddock have any idea of like guerrilla warfare at this time? Like,
not really. Braddock had never seen this style of warfare before. Obviously, who in his army had seen this style before? Washington and other American militia members. Guess what we had just said about what they think about those militia members. Part of the problem with the British is they don't listen to the people who are there on the ground. That's it. And we'll see this kind of again and again until the Brits kind of get their head around this concept.
Obviously, they quickly unlearn it in time for what war? The Revolution. They really do not ever really get their head around the fact that you cannot combat people fighting in an ambush or from the trees behind stone walls, as we'll see in the Battle of Lexington and Concord, with regulars like this. They'll eventually adapt. It'll take a while for them to do so. Here, though, the Battle of Monongahela, it destroys Braddock and his column, and Braddock is killed in the aftermath, or during the battle. Any questions?
French native strategy was very akin to a modern style of warfare, guerrilla warfare.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because the French were outnumbered, right?
Yeah.
They were outnumbered, and they defeated a larger, better organized British force because they adapted themselves to what?
Their geography, their terrain.
The geography and terrain.
How outnumbered were the French?
Off the top of my head, there were about 2,000 British regulars, and by this point, they'd assembled another 1,000 or so American colonials. Some were soldiers, many more were actually the teamsters that were bringing up the rear. So we're talking about 1,700 odd French natives and French colonials and natives, and about 3,500 British total. It's about a 2-to-1 advantage.
So were the French trained by the natives for this?
No, that's a great question. The French actually had a mixture. They had a mixture of regular regiments, a very small proportion, just a couple. Those are the guys who blocked the road. But the rest were French habitants, the French militia, who were trained like the natives. So firing from the trees were also plenty of Canadian militia who had adapted to the warfare they had seen, right? Make sense? That's why we keep hammering on the cultural reasons for battles like this, the reasons that produce the tactics we see. So if you are talking about the Battle of the Monongahela, I don't know why I want to say the banana of the Monongahela, the Battle of the Monongahela as your case study, what would you talk about in terms of the cultural reasons the battle went the way it went?
Because the British were used to their style of warfare.
The British were unable to adapt to the New World style of warfare, and the French and natives were what?
They already had.
They already had. And there you have it. You have the tactics of the battle itself are produced not just by the cultures, but by the cultures and their relationship even to the geography of the area.
Another example of culture dictating how they fight is like the Japanese suicide charges. It may seem foolish to us, but to them it was honorable.
When we talk, hopefully next semester, assuming I'm teaching the second part, we will talk about the Bushido Code and Japanese Imperial Army's adoption of samurai values and how that adoption will impact the Pacific War. Very good. It's exactly a 1-to-1 comparison. Okay, so do we understand the Battle of Monongahela? Okay, so now that Britain and France are officially at war, we probably need to understand the rest of the war and why it lasts so many years. It is a 7-year war, though we generally date it a bit strangely in the Americas because of Washington.
It's like 9 years.
It's technically 9 years, but the first 2 years aren't really what we call active. You get Washington's thing, start stuff. Then you get a long gap as the British and French try and figure out what they want to do. Then Braddock marches, and Braddock takes a long ass time to get there. So really, it's almost a 2-year gap between when we get this. So let's talk about the European context.
This is the First World War.
This is the First World War. Very good. You recognize anybody up there of those 3 people?
Is that Frederick?
That is very good. That is Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great. We need to know him. He is one of the most important military commanders of the period, and definitely the most important until Napoleon. I'll reference him again and again, so make sure you understand who I'm talking about. Frederick the Great is king of what? Prussia. Prussia is a state in Germany. It is in the northeast. You see this really funky little landmass here? It's also there, and then splits of it are over all across Germany. Voltaire had a very famous quip about it, that Prussia wasn't a real state, it was just a country of border strips, because it was so weird as a colony. It was a bunch of different inheritances by a bunch of different German Prussian princes. He had the Frederick, and the Prussians had one big enemy over and over. Who? You may recognize her.
Catherine?
Not Catherine. We'll get to a Catherine later.
From Austria?
Very good. So we have,
Marie?
you're there. We have Frederick and the Prussians, and Austria led by
Maria Teresa. Maria Teresa. Does anybody know anything about her? She had a very odd coming to the throne moment, about 20 years before this. She was the only child of the Emperor of Austria. And on his deathbed, he was very, very worried that as a woman entering politics, entering the political realm as an empress, that she would be taken advantage of. And the gigantic inheritance that she was getting, the entire Austrian Empire, you see how big this big old chunk of Austria is? This big old empire would be immediately attacked by all of Austria's enemies the second she ascended to the throne. And so he spent the last decade of his life working on a plan, which he called the pragmatic sanction, that he had almost all of the major kingdoms of Europe, French, British, the Prussians, the Russians, you name it. He had them sign papers saying, when Maria Theresa becomes the Empress of Austria, you will not attack her. You will not try and rip off pieces of her empire. He paid dearly for this. Almost all of those signatories on the pragmatic sanction cost the Austrians something, whether small strips of territory or money or diplomatic advantage. This was a painstaking allocation of resources. And as you might expect, the second he died, guess what? They all attacked her anyways.
You're next.
Particularly this guy. Frederick the Great was one of those very interesting men who hit the historical timeline at the right time. Mostly, just like Alexander the Great, he inherited what? Empire. Alexander didn't inherit an empire, he inherited an army. Just like Alexander, thousands of years before, whose father, Philip of Macedon, had built a machine. Frederick inherited a machine from his father. The Prussians, and let this statistic sink in, the Prussians were the 11th biggest country in Europe by population. Anybody want to take a shot at how big their military was, though? 4th biggest. They kept a huge amount of men under arms. It was the reason, and in the end is the reason Prussia develops on such a military line. The reason eventually Germany will become so militaristic when it's taken over by Prussia is the fact that the Prussians had an army that was the state, essentially. I can't remember which philosopher made it, Voltaire again, makes the quip. Prussia isn't an army or isn't a state, it's an army with a state. As you might expect then, the military traditions of Prussia will guide its decision making. And so, in the war before this, the first war that you don't need to remember it, the War of Austrian Succession, here's the person who was succeeding to the throne. And during that war, Frederick used the opportunity to steal a big chunk of her inheritance. The territory of Silesia, here. A very, very rich, very, very heavily populated, very, very important part of the Austrian Empire. And he invaded it and took it during the previous war. As you might expect, Maria Theresa is still not happy about that. And in the end, the reason the 7 Years' War expands from just our pals, the French and the British, is because there's other things going on in Europe. Particularly, Maria Theresa's interest in doing what? Reclaiming that land. That's, in the end, why this war starts back up. Frederick is getting to feel like he's surrounded. It's kind of a consistent thing you see in German history throughout most of its military engagements, World War I and World War II in particular, that fear of being encircled. He finds out that Austria, who for most of its history, who hated the French, have suddenly allied themselves with the French. Austria and France have committed what at the time was called the diplomatic revolution. For the previous 100 years, they were at each other's throats. Now, all of a sudden, the French and the Austrians, the two biggest land empires in Europe, are buddies.
And then, to top it off for the guy, he hears another empire has decided to get involved. That's who? Complete the friendship. Who else would surround the Germans? The Russians. Now, we'll come to Russia in a bit. The Russians are not the big Russia we know today. It's a much smaller, much more impoverished nation. But together, Russia, Austria, and France sure look like a problem for who? Old Frederick. And Frederick is not a dummy enough to know that they aren't entirely conspiring to do what? Very much so. Austria wants Silesia back, and these two countries simply hate him. He did not do himself very many favors. He was a bit of an odd guy. He was very, very smart, very, very talented. He dabbled in poetry and music. He was very much an enlightened monarch. He was also cold. He was very, very militaristic. He had a very big problem with his dad. He had what we would call today, in the technical term, daddy issues. For the simple fact that when he was young, he had a good reason to have his daddy issues. When he was young, he almost certainly had a male lover who he had tried to escape Prussia with, and Dad caught both of them and did what?
Killed the lover.
Made him watch how he killed the lover. He had a bad upbringing. Well, I don't want to write this all off as, Daddy really roughed up my childhood.
This was Russia or Prussia?
This is Prussia. That's Frederick the Great's childhood. Sorry, this is Frederick the Great's childhood. He watches his lover killed in front of him by his dad, who's mad at him. It turns him into a bit of a callous bastard, as you might expect.
I can see why Baron von Steuben fled Germany,
He was a Prussian. We'll talk about him there. There's a reason that when the American Revolution needed a guy to teach them tactics, they picked the country that didn't do anything else. So, Frederick, obviously, is beginning to look for what if he's surrounded? Allies. That's the natural move here. He knows another war is coming. The French, the Austrians, and the Russians are beginning to look like they don't not only want to humble him, they want to embarrass him, destroy Prussia if possible. And so he looks to the only country he can really look to. Exactly. Great Britain.
What about the other German states and the?
Great question. So Great Britain and Prussia form the other set of alliances. There are plenty of other countries in these alliance sets. I don't need you guys to memorize all of them. But generally, all of the countries close to France end up with France, particularly Bavaria and the other smaller German states. Generally, though, he doesn't have a friend in Europe. Frederick is not the most well-liked guy, for obvious reasons, especially after the Silesian adventure. However, he finds a willing and able ally in Britain, led at the time by, let's get this guy down, William Pitt. This is William Pitt the Younger, William Pitt the Elder. Yes, William Pitt.
What about William Pitt?
There's two William Pitts. The one who won the War of Austria. There's several William Pitts, all of whom, and this William Pitt is obviously, he's not the King of England, he is its Prime Minister. Britain's kings and queens don't have the same absolutist leadership that we'll talk about with other countries. Unlike Frederick or Maria Theresa, who make the political and military decisions, the British government is led by its PM, who's William Pitt at the time. Now, it's not the time. Let's stop there, and we'll pick back up with the 7 Years' War on Friday, okay?
Axis and allies all over.
We're going to do a lot of this rearranging of alliances to fight the next battle.
If you don't count the Napoleonic Wars, the Napoleonic Wars were technically World War II. World War I was World War III. World War II was World War IV. Think about it.
I would put it this way. French and Indian War is your first truly